Let me bring you back to the year 2017. The internet was a simpler place. FNAF had recently debuted their most recent game, Sister Location, and while some people loved it, others thought that the story was getting a bit too complicated. Players were suffering from animatronic fatigue and desperately craved a breath of fresh air. Elsewhere in the horror genre, Tattetail was finding its own Christmas horror style with its creepy 90s nostalgic toys, and Hello Neighbour was, doing its own thing. Then, out of nowhere came this small ink studio game, a game that single-handedly convinced millions of people that 1930s animation could actually be kinda cool. And on the surface, Bendy and the Ink Machine looked like a stroke of absolute genius. Bendy completely owned the internet, generating an endless wave of let's plays, deep dive theory videos, and iconic fan-made songs. Me personally was introduced to Bendy with Jacksepticeye's gameplay of Chapter 2, and man was I hooked. It had the atmosphere, the aesthetic, the merchandise, and a large community rewriting the lore every single week. Wait, that's not supposed to be right. Hi, welcome to the show, it's Craft, and today we're taking a look back at the Mascot horror franchise that practically redefined the entire genre of Mascot horror, only to slowly collapse under the weight of its own ambition. Because behind the gorgeous inky curtains of an atmospheric gameplay, the game was a beautiful structural mess. Held together just by episodic release dates and definitely a few internet theorists, it is a masterclass in how to achieve absolute success, but at the same time completely forgetting how to work a smoothly functioning horror game story. Well, firstly, we must understand the chaotic reality of the development of this indie game. Bendy and the Ink Machine was not a fully realized masterpiece as many would have thought to be. It was merely put together piece by piece and chapter by chapter. And might I remind you that this was in an era where developers had to quickly rush out new chapters for their explosive, impatient audience. Hence, they didn't have the time to fully code and refurbish the game nor figure out where a clear definitive story was going to be. When Chapter 1 first released in early of 2017, nobody was planning it to be a humongous success. It really was just a humble small demo uploaded to GameJolt to test out a neat atmospheric 1930s gimmick. But of course, the internet had an almost feral reaction for Mascot horrors, and the algorithm chose Bendy. Overnight, a massive global fandom materialized out of practically nowhere, violently demanding answers to a story that, in reality, the creators were still in the process of making. This is where the tragedy of the game's development truly begins, trapped in a cycle of the on-the-go improvising, where the story itself was in actuality just being written on the fly. While the Meatly definitely had a good idea of how the game would begin and end, the massive story gaps between them was kinda blank, forcing them to invent the story plots of Chapter 2 till 4 while the whole internet watched. Because the horror game community loves to spend weeks writing lore analysis and theory videos over a single pixel, the Bendy team faced immense pressure to measure the escalating hype, leading them to use fan feedback and community theories as guidance for the game's script. And to be fair, it definitely was not their fault. For example, the sudden explosive popularity of a character could completely rewrite the trajectory of a franchise overnight, which is exactly why Alice Angel was abruptly dragged from the background of a Chapter 2 poster and forced into the spotlight as the main antagonist of Chapter 3. For fans, the result wasn't just a front row seat to the ongoing story of Bendy, you were witnessing a chaotic, multi-year public beta test. As the team developers evolved to support a grander scope of the later chapters, the team will also routinely loop back to patch the older chapters so everything matched with the overall setting of the game. In practice, this was created so that the code can actually help with the overlapping library of assets and game glitches and, of course, bug fixes. But by the time the final chapter rolled around, the game was already tangled under the weight of its own story. The narrative had expanded into massive theories all over the internet, and the underlying mechanical gameplay was just a tech demo held together with unfinished ideas and gameplay mechanics. While Chapter 5 was already thought of from the beginning, the fans unfortunately didn't feel like it was a polished, earned climax. It definitely felt like a desperate sprint to just finish before the entire project ended, and ironically, the episodic releases are the exact reason why Bendy succeeded but it's also the exact reason why the final chapters are permanently scarred by the chaos. If the development of the game was a prime example in structurally improvising as chapters go by, the actual gameplay was where the illusion of a clean, steady game completely fell apart. Here you are in the beginning of the game as the protagonist, Henry, an aging animator returning to the abandoned workplace after a long 30 years. You'll definitely expect a slow burn, haunting atmospheric descent into a corporate alchemy, but instead, the game immediately just hands you a tool and spoon feeds you with instructions like an overworked studio intern. To progress through and through the grand studio, you don't feel like you are using your wits and ideas to solve puzzles. It felt like you were running errands, as the display messages from the bottom of the screen usually gives you an indicator of what to do. You'll spend the vast majority of your gameplay actually just paying attention at the bottom of the screen, running back and forth through a maze of corridors to fetch gears, turn valve handles, and collect random cups of inks. Well, while some people might argue that it definitely is a good feature, and yes, I do understand your point, you need clear directions, but it is supposed to be given clearly by the story narrative, game mechanics, and overall pacing of the entire gameplay. It really shouldn't rely on a simple pop-up message that can dictate your overall strategy of the game. This grueling design reaches its absolute soul-crushing peak in Chapter 3. Here you are introduced to the villainous Alice Angel, and first of all, let me say, she was introduced almost perfectly. A brilliant body horror design of a character who represents the terrifying analogy of physical perfection.
It made me an angel.
Well, she did kind of escalate the grand story, sort of. I'll get to that part later. And her voice line sends shivers down your spine.
Doors.
She is intimidating and fierce, but instead of engaging in a tense rivalry or possibly raising up the stakes of the story to a higher level, she just locks you in a basement and forces you to play errands. Yeah, that's it. Unless you're into that, you are sent on a series of repetitive quests, returning to the basement once more to await further orders from Alice Angel. And Boris the Wolf, a character that intrigued many fans by his appearance in the ending of Chapter 2, just stands there, staring blankly into space, contributing absolutely nothing. It is a pacing nightmare, disguised as tension. Whatever atmospheric dread the game manages to build is instantly diluted the moment you realize you aren't running for your life from an ancient ink-born evil, you're just running errands for it. Adding more to this relentless backtracking is a combat system that can only be described as kinda weightless. When the game occasionally forces you to fight enemies, the game instantly devolves into a clumsy, rhythmic exercise in a bad collision detection. You spam your weapon at inky enemies until they magically evaporate. There is no drawback nor satisfying crunch to it, and absolutely zero strategy needed. It could also feel like a walking simulator sometimes, with you just spamming your weapon while also just going back a slight bit to avoid your enemies. And then finally, there's the complete lack of consequences when you actually die. In a normal survival horror game, death is actually supposed to be the ultimate punishment. You freaking lost, man. A terrifying reset that punishes you to re-evaluate your strategy in playing the game. But in Bendy, dying carries absolutely no weight. The game doesn't send you back to a previous save or forces you to retry a difficult re-encounter. Instead, you simply walk through a brief ink tunnel and spawn right back into action, only to find that the enemies you are fighting are still carrying the exact same damage you gave them before you died. You aren't playing as a vulnerable protagonist trying to survive the horrifying monsters. You're actually just immortal, effortlessly forcing your way through the game because to you, death is merely a nuisance. TLDR, it really was a mechanical disaster, but millions of us kept playing anyways. Alright, this is the part of the story where we have to ask the real question. If the game was such a mechanical nightmare, why did it work? Why did we care? Why did millions of people buy merchandise, write songs, and discuss the franchise till this day? Why is Bendy and the Ink Machine still one of the best Mascot horror games of all time? Well, the answer definitely doesn't lie in the mechanics of the game at all. It lies in the sheer terrifying brilliance of its unique take on horror. Bendy and the Ink Machine did something very few Mascot horror games ever achieve. It created a story that was genuinely tragically human. It wasn't just about dumb monsters jumping out of nowhere. It was a deep introspective of a creative insanity, corporate greed, and the literal sacrifice of humans for the sake of a company. At the end of this nightmare is the man himself, Joey Drew, a man who represents the ultimate monstrous peak of a creative ego. He didn't create his studio to make people happy. He built it to redefine the biblical creations of life and to feed his own god complex. And eventually, he began sacrificing his own co-workers to bring his drawings to life. The horror of Bendy is the horror of stolen identities. You can see it in Sammy Lawrence, the music director turned mass cultist, trapped in a cycle of worshipping a demon just to cope with how all things are. You can see it in Alice Angel, whose desperate, tragic obsession with physical perfection drove her to tear apart other people just so she could feel beautiful and accepted again. These aren't just monsters designed to give you a quick scare. They are actual tragic representations of real people, permanently trapped in a corporate monstrosity. They are artists who have dedicated their entire life to their work, only to be consumed by the very machine they helped build. And the ink machine itself? Well, it really is a beautiful metaphor for the toxic nature of work culture in this world, an endless cycle of consumption that corrupts its creators. This profound narrative is the true masterpiece. Yes, the game could feel repetitive, the combat could feel janky, and there might not be any stakes. But the moment you hear Sammy's desperate, echoing voice, or maybe Alice's deformed face in the shadows, you are completely immersed back into this tragic story. Look, I can really go on and on about this, because this part itself really deserves a video on its own. And maybe it will be, but the Mascot horror of Bendy is indeed a remarkable genius that I've actually made a video about it if you want to check it out after this. Bendy and the Ink Machine really is a beautiful game. It is a monument to a highly specific golden age of the internet, where passion and community hype could bypass the need for a polished game design entirely. It proves that sometimes an impeccable atmosphere, iconic character designs, and a genuinely tragic story are more than enough to make us overlook the technical flaws of the game. We didn't keep playing because the combat was fun. We kept playing because we were gripped by the atmosphere. We loved the many amazing iconic character designs. We wanted to be a part of this franchise and watch as chapters go by as the full story reveals itself. And we actually did. We watched as the chapters go by, unfolding itself by the moment, and the story is still revealing itself till this day. To call it a global cultural phenomenon might be an overstatement, but on the internet, its footprint is definitely undeniable. Bendy practically laid the groundwork and the aesthetic standard for a modern wave of Mascot horror that will soon follow afterwards. Bendy wasn't a perfect game by any stretch, but the dark, beautiful game is an internet horror classic that will be remembered for a very, very long time. Hey, thanks for watching. It's been really fun exploring back my childhood with this game. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Anyways, it's been Adriocraft, and see you now.